All right, then. Welcome, everybody. This is Lars Light from Tasting Panel Magazine, here to welcome you to our Back to Spirit School final webinar of this series. This one's called Warming Up to Whiskey Global Style. I'd like to thank our sponsors, Liars Non-Alcoholic Spirits, FIU's Bacardi Center of Excellence, and of course the Tasting Panel. Just a reminder that this is being recorded. It is going to be on Facebook Live right now. And there will also be a link from tastingpanelmagazine.com, and all you students at FIU Chaplin School of Hospitality and Tourism Management will also be know where to look for it and keep up with your studies. There will be a printed recap in the January-February issue of Tasting Panel Magazine. So without further ado, let's say hi first to our sponsors. Hello, Professor Brian Connors, FIU's Director of the Bacardi Center for Excellence. Why don't you give us an update on what's going on at your fantastic institution of higher learning?
Uncle Lars, how are you, sir? Always a pleasure. I can't believe this is our final, if you will, our final back to school.
We'll be back in another video.
Yeah, I have a good feeling we will be as well. So again, thank you to the whole panel and for all the listeners. But hey, Bacardi Center of Excellence, it's so great to be on campus here. We have students in the classroom. Our classes are filling up again. So a lot of our planning has done a great work. But for our industry partners and friends out there, hey, please join us on Tuesday, January 23rd at 1 o'clock Eastern Standard Time. We're going to be joined by not one, but two of the Bacardi portfolio legends. So Dr. Ann Brock from Bombay Sapphire will be joining us, as well as Stephanie McLeod, the master blender. Gareth, thank you very much. That you'll hear Gareth talk about a little bit from our friends at Dewar's Alvefeld. So we're really looking forward to that, and everybody can join us. So please check us out on LinkedIn. Just look up Bacardi Center of Excellence. The invites are there. We'll keep on pumping them out throughout the weekend, but everyone is welcome to join us, and we will be rebroadcasting that on our illustrious podcast, Two Bar Stools and a Knife, as well. Two other great things going on. COVID slowed us down, but not that much. We have some great new content coming out on Bacardi Teach called Better Bar Methods. We teamed up with Unfiltered Hospitality. Some really new state-of-the-art stuff. We're looking forward to that. And last but not least, I can't believe it's less than 100 days. We have the South Beach Wine and Food Festival quickly approaching. Dodge, please notice that I said wine and food, not food. Wine Festival. Thank you. It's only taken me 8 years. But at the same time, keep an eye on that space, because we got some really cool dynamic solutions. Keyword there, Lars, solutions heading our way.
Absolutely. Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you, Professore. Appreciate it very much. And a quick word, Kyle Billings from Liars. You guys are just, seriously, non-alcoholic is sort of setting the wine on fire, the world on fire. So tell us a little bit what's going on there.
Yeah. Thank you, Lars. We're really excited. And listen, I'm excited about this panel because I think the team at Liars are big drinkers. We certainly appreciate spirits and all their glory. I'm excited to hear about Scotch, about bourbon, about all the things in between. And really the deal for us is just giving people that opportunity to drink it in kind of a lower, no alcoholic format. So I'm a big advocate of, personally, I love old fashioned. Sazeracs might be my favorite drink of all time. And then whiskey sours. I drink way too many of those, maybe during meetings, maybe not, that's less up to interpretation, but no, I'm excited that Liars can do a lot of the things that, that your whiskey counterparts can do, just in a format that everybody can enjoy. We're going to be talking with Robert Albright today, who is one of our star mixologists in Texas. And he's going to go over the American malt, which is our kind of bourbon variant, but there may or may not be a Scotch variant in the future. So keep your eyes, watch this space. Without further ado, I'll give it back to you, Lars, and you guys can enjoy Robert's presentation.
Great. Thanks for the tease. We will be watching out. So as a responsible moderator, I want to start off by giving you a wee dram of information here. Obviously, as we know, Scotch, whiskey or whiskey, depending on where it's made. It's EY in the US and Ireland, Y everywhere else. It's sort of like Shiraz and Syrah. Sometimes it also depends on the style. So the rules seem to be getting a little bit looser. The word comes from the ancient Gaelic water of life, what the Latins called aqua vitae, and became whiskey to us. It's a distilled alcoholic beverage from fermented grain mash. It sounds pretty simple, but it's not, is it? And so I'm going to start off by introducing somebody of much higher authority than me to talk about whiskey to us, Professor Nathan Dodge from FIU's Chaplin School of Hospitality and Tourism Management. He's our spirits professor. But before I do that, Nathan, I know you've got your preferences, I've got mine, but I'm going to put up a little poll. Dawn, if you could bring that up, and I want to ask everybody, ask our audience to chime in here a little bit and tell us, how do you prefer your whiskey? There's only 4 options there. Sorry, Kyle, we didn't put up any sours there, but maybe we'll have a write-in vote for that. So go ahead, and you're going to have 90 seconds. That poll will be up. The minute you cast your vote, you'll be able to see the lovely Nathan Dodge, and in the meantime, you can still hear his presentation. So, Professor Dodge, did you get out of Dodge, or are you still in it?
I feel like I'm still in Dodge City. That's why I'm wearing the hat today. But I thank you for inviting me, Lars. I appreciate it, and thank you for the tasting panel, and Liars Non-Alcoholic for inviting us. Yes, I am Nathan Dodge. I'm one of the professors at FIU Chaplain School of Hospitality and Tourism Management, and I am a spirits professor. Which, when I found out that was a thing, I was psyched, because I had never heard of such a thing as a spirits professor, and I'm loving every minute of it. Before I tell how I drink my whiskey, let me talk a little bit about what is whiskey. So Lars is 100% right. We call it, it was originally a Gaelic word, whiskabau. We're going back to the 15th century. We have the Irish and the Scotch. I don't know who invented it. The Irish say they do. The Scotch say they do. I think it was the Irish. From what I understand, it was made in Irish monasteries. And they came up with this idea of water of life. And they were distilling grain beers, basically, and turning them into whiskey. Now, first of all, water of life, I will tell you this. If your water comes out of the tap that color, do not drink it. That is not good living water. So, but it's delicious when it comes out of a nice bottle of whiskey. What is whiskey? Whiskey is a grain spirit that's aged, usually about 3 years, or as long as you want, in oak. Now, here's the kicker. If we're made in Ireland, we're looking at 1 grain. If we're made in Scotland, it could be grain. It could be I totally lost my train of thought. It could be a blended whiskey, a blended Scotch, a blended grain, a blended malt, a single grain. So now we have all of these subcategories. Come across the Atlantic, I'm drinking bourbon. What is bourbon? Bourbon is a whiskey, but bourbon is at least 51% corn, which corn is a grain. It's not a vegetable. Stop telling your kids it's a vegetable. It is a grain. Now, we are aging it, and that the oak is going to help add flavors. It's going to help remove some of that, the harshness, but it's going to bring in a lot of tannins, a lot of vanilla. And it's now made around the world. Again, we started in Ireland, we started in Scotland, we've made it over to America. If we go up to Canada, we're going to drink a lot more rye, but now we can go to Japan and have whiskey. I've had great whiskeys from Japan, great whiskeys from India, Singapore. I've had whiskeys from South America, from the Caribbean. Whiskey is, I was got in trouble when we were doing our rum panel, and I said rum is whatever rum wants to be, as long as it's made out of sugarcane. It's kind of the wild, wild west. Well, whiskey can be the wild, wild west too. Now, if we break it down and say Scotch, we know what Scotch is. We break it down and say bourbon, we know what bourbon is. We break it down and say Canadian whiskey, we know what Canadian whiskey is. But whiskey in general could be a lot of different things. And then the whole E versus no E thing, that just is another way just to confuse everybody. Absolutely, yes. What happens is what? Extraction, evaporation, oxidation, concentration, filtration, and coloration. Thank you, Lars.
You sound like the lawyer from that Seinfeld episode. Never mind.
But as far as the question that was originally posed, how do I drink my whiskey? Now, the best whiskey is the whiskey that's in my glass. And the best way to drink the whiskey is the way that I'm drinking at the time that I'm drinking it. Right now, I have it in a beautiful Riedel glass. I have a little bit of water. I'm drinking 100 proof. 100 proof, it's a little hot for me, so I'm going to add a few drops of water. If I was drinking something 80 proof, just straight up neat. There are times, hot day, I want to have an ice cube. Sometimes I'm going to have a cocktail. It really is going to be your choice. As far as what you're drinking in, again, I do like this Riedel glass. The Glencairn glass that you can see on Lars's screen behind him, that is the traditional way of drinking your single malts. But I grew up in South Florida. We're in the South. I have been to many SEC college games and drinking whiskey out of a red Solo cup. You know, there are little lines on a red Solo cup. I find that the top line is where I want my whiskey. I was told that's
you
not
mean the
best way.
lip?
Yeah, the lip, the top. So that is the basics of whiskey, but I know we've got some great guys on here that are going to tell us about their brands and the history and traditions of their spirits that they're talking about today.
Fantastic. Thank you, Professore. Perfect timing on that too. And Dawn, can you tell us what the results of our poll was? All right, a lot of people out there going on the neat side. Some rocks, little soda. Nobody's going for water. And that's interesting. So I want to ask a question of Professor Dodge before he signs off, and maybe some of you expert distillers can also address this question as well. Is my understanding is that not when you're drinking whiskey, that's a whole different preference, and we didn't ask that question, but we didn't ask the question of when you're tasting whiskey. Is it true that a drop or two of water helps exalt some of the flavors in the profile?
It absolutely helps to open up the whiskey. It's been in a bottle. It does help to open it the same way that if you took a bottle of wine and you decanted it, it's helping to open up the flavors a little bit more. Again, if I'm drinking a really hot whiskey, 100, 101, if I had some, again, going back to my college days, had some kickin' chicken 101, I'm definitely going to add a little bit of water to that just to be able to mellow it out and be able to enjoy it a little better.
Cool. But my understanding was that for judging whiskey, for really trying to understand it in comparison, just using a straw and putting a couple of drops of water in helps you get a better sense of what the whiskey's all about.
Also to help it go, hits your olfactory sense a little bit better when you do that.
Exactly. Exactly.
All right. I'd be happy to hop in here really quickly as well and just say
Please
that
do,
in terms of proofing, in terms of evaluating whiskeys prior to blending, prior to batching and blending, because alcohol is a topical anesthetic, right? It will dull your olfactory bulb, which is why when I'm evaluating casks to add into a blend, I'll generally take it down to about 25%. ABV about 50 proof. And the reason for that is just that anything higher than that, you're gonna be anesthetizing in a sense, the very senses that you want to use in order to make the blend. So tasting and evaluating and smelling whiskey at different proofs, I think, is necessary in the process of evaluation.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Gareth. Ari, sorry. Thank you very much, Ari. And I'm going to introduce you shortly to Ari and explain why his comments were so poignant. But we're going to stick with our original order and go back to the order for the panelists. Ari, we'll see you again shortly. And I want to start it off with Robert Albright, who's the brand ambassador. As Kyle mentioned earlier, he's based in Texas with Lyre's Non-Alcoholic Spirits, based in Houston, if I understand correctly. And
yes.
You started your career in some of the top bars of San Francisco's cocktail scene.
Yes,
so,
sir.
Please tell us what you got.
Well, today I'm going to kind of take it back. I'm going to play with a little classic cocktail for you guys and do one of Kyle's favorites, a Sazerac. Lyre's is pretty unique because we not only have an American malt, which is a bourbon replica, but we've just relaunched our absinthe. So we can actually use the absinthe in the Sazerac and keep it non-alc all the way through. So we're going to start off with 2 ounces of our American malt. Drop that in there. Little 1/4 ounce of brown turbinado sugar that I make in-house. Grab a cube, give it a stir. But while I'm giving the stir, I'll always play with my absinthe and give that a little wash of the glass. But since it's non-alc, we don't dump the absinthe. We leave it in there just so you get more of that flavor in there. Sound effects are always my favorite. I don't know if you guys can hear those. Give it a good little mist with the lemon here, and it just fell right on it. And you have a non-alc Sazerac. The really unique thing is being in the non-alc category, a lot of traditional bourbon drinkers don't know that you can have traditional cocktails with your bourbons and absinthe. Another cocktail that we're going to do is, since we're in the South, a Southern Gentleman. Take some fresh blackberries, a little bit of mint, another 2 ounces of our American malt, a little bit of lemon juice, a good little shake.
Too bad we couldn't hear the shaking sound. That's my favorite sound. That and the champagne cork.
Yes. Instead of a rocks glass, I always throw it into a goblet. Make it look fun.
Is it a flavor thing or is it just a look thing?
A look thing.
Cool.
Give that a little bit of a pop. Drop some fresh soda water in there. And now you have a Southern Gentleman. Nice little patio pounder, as many of you know. And down in Florida, we love patio weather out here in the South. So we get to have a lot of fun with that.
Awesome. All right, Robert. Thank you.
Absolutely.
All right. So now we're going to go to Gareth Howells. Gareth was also just actually, I found out, made a recent visit to FIU. He is the North American Single Malts Ambassador for Bacardi, representing Aberfeldy and Dewar's. He's a unique combination of being an English immigrant of Irish heritage, moved to the U.S. in 2010, joined Bacardi in 2017, was heavily involved in the New York City cocktail scene, presented at Tales of the Cocktail, Drink Boston, Whiskey Fest. He's really gets around. He's also the co-founder of, I think this is really cool, the Bushwick Industrial Collective, which is an education training resource for bartenders in Brooklyn. So congratulations on that, Gareth, and welcome.
Lars, thank you. That's such a nice way of basically saying I'm a mutt. I love it.
We're Americans, we're all mutts.
So born in one, raised and educated in the other. If you were to ask my mother, my better half, 100% is the Irish half. My dad never disagreed, so we're just gonna leave it there. But gents, thank you so much for having us along today. I really appreciate it. Now, I'm going to be taking up a little bit more time than the rest of the presenters, and the reason for this is quite simple. My mentor, my brother in whiskey, Gabe Cardarella, who would normally for Bacardi, he is the North American Dewar's ambassador, was unable to make the session today. Having previously been a national ambassador for Dewar's Blended Scotch, I'm kind of going to cover single malts and blends at the same time, but I'm going to be telling it through the optic, the story of the Aberfeldy distillery, which, as we're going to find out, is going to tie in to the history of Dewar's as a blend. I've got to thank Nathan, by the way. You stole a lot of my rhetoric before I started. You did a very good job of explaining that global landscape of whiskey and what whiskey is. And for everyone here, quite simply, whiskey, it's a distilled spirit made from fermented grain. It can be made anywhere in the world using any distillation technology. It can be aged in any type of wood, depending on where you're coming from and what legal terms you have you're bound by or you have to work within. But we're going to be talking about Scotch. And when I say we, I mean I am going to be talking about Scotch. I know we've got an incredible single malt distillery coming up after me as well. So I'm going to try not to steal too much thunder from the gentleman who's waving and smiling right now. And it's such a pleasure to see you on this panel. I had no idea that we were going to be together. But within that global landscape, when you talk about Scotch whiskey, what makes Scotch Scotch? Quite simply, it has to be malted, mashed, and distilled in Scotland, bottled in Scotland, aged for a minimum of 3 years in oak, and bottled at a minimum of 40% ABV, or for all of you Yanks out there, 80 proof. And I say Yanks with the most loving respect possible from an Irish English immigrant. If all of those things hold to be true, then the liquid indeed in the glass that we're drinking from is Scotch whiskey. But within that Scotch landscape, it gets a little bit more complicated because there's two distillates that are predominantly made within Scotland. We have our grain whiskey and we have our malt whiskey. Now, I'm going to be talking about, I'm going to be referencing both of these as we go through this educational session. But out of those two distillates, you actually get 5 predominant types and styles of whiskey that come from the country. And the funny thing is, if we were in Scotland, we wouldn't be calling it Scotch, we'd just be calling it whiskey. But again, we're in America, so we're going to have to be referencing it to Scotch just so we understand that global landscape that we live within. But within those 5 categories, or those 5 predominant types of whiskey that come out of Scotland, we have our malt whiskey, our blended Scotch. We then have our vatted or blended malt. We then have our blended grain and our single grain whiskey. But we're going to be talking about 2 specifically, which is blended and then also malt whiskey itself. And the funny thing is, I've been with Bacardi for nigh on 5 years now. When you look and you understand the history of not only the development of the Scotch whiskey industry as we understand it nowadays, the stories of people who started, if you were to look early to mid 1800s and moving on from there, are very similar. And I'm going to tell you the story through the optics of Dewar's, and then ultimately what the Dewar's family did in terms of the malt distilleries and the whiskey that they created. So Dewar's Blended Scotch, it was founded in 1846 by John Dewar. Now back then, John Dewar, he was not a distiller. He was an entrepreneur, a businessman, a merchant. Dewar's started on the high street in Perth, Lanarkshire, as a fine whiskey and goods emporium. He learned his trade initially blending tea and coffee and chocolate. Now, I know that I'm talking about Dewar's, but you could apply this story to virtually every other major blending house that exists or was founded in and around the same time. You look at the story of the Walkers, virtually identical in terms of how they started and how they got to be where they are right now. So again, 1846, businessman. He specialized effectively in purchasing other people's whiskey and then blending a series of things in such a way whereby hopefully, ultimately, they would become bigger than the sum of its parts. Now, I'm going to segue very quickly because this confuses a lot of people, not just when we talk about the world of Scotch whiskey, but with any whiskey. All whiskey is blended unless it's a single cask. Blending is the artistry that exists within the industry that not only every single one of my panelists exists within, but the world of whiskey exists within. It's about construction, it's about consistency, it's about the creation of flavor profiles, a house style, so to speak. And that was really the birthplace for the world of blended Scotch whiskey, because Dewar's, J&B, Cutty, White and Mackay, it doesn't matter who you look at within the world of Scotch whiskey, it was about the creation of effectively a replicatable house style. If you drink a blended Scotch whiskey, you have to know and understand that that's a whiskey that's created by the people who are making it. Effectively, one of the most important things within business is consistency. It's the ability to create something that your customers will recognize and know time and time again. And I mean, when we talk about the Dewar's family, but also again, any of the major blending houses, it was about making something whereby people would recognize that that was the whiskey that they were creating. So if we were to talk about, let's say, a house style for Dewar's, and I know the house style very intimately, it would be like barreled aged orchard fruits drizzled in honey. Although there's many marks that exist within that Dewar's portfolio, you need to understand that each and every one of those bottles is made by Dewar's rather than being made by someone else. Blending, being a master blender is massively important. Now, Dewar's has been around for 175 years, and each and every mark of Dewar's, and again, you could apply this to the rest of the blenders who exist within Scotland. What they do is they take a combination of grain and malt whiskies, and they blend them together. So specifically within Dewar's, each and every bottle of Dewar's is a combination of up to 40 different grain and malt whiskies that are blended together. Now, today, as we speak, our master blender is Stephanie McLeod. Now, to put this into context, since Dewar's was founded, and remember, 1846, it's an 175-year blending legacy this house has had. There's only 7 master blenders that have existed and worked for Dewar's. It started with A.J. Cameron. Now, he was the gentleman who was responsible in 1899 for the blending and the release of what we still know and love today as Dewar's White Label. That's quite a significant legacy to have. Now, Stephanie is only the 7th person since that point in time to be doing what she does. And effectively, she is the gatekeeper. She is the protector of the flavor profile of the Dewar's blends. And again, remember, when we talk about blended whiskey, it's about consistency. It's about being able to replicate time and time again that exalted and recognized flavor profile for the whiskeys. Now, will that have changed over time? Of course. Will there have been significant changes in terms of the way that people drink, their understanding and what they're looking for in terms of the whiskey that they drink? Of course there is, but effectively it's an apprenticeship from one person to another throughout the entirety of that time period. But again, talking about Stephanie, because she is crucially important, and I do believe that Stephanie is going to be coming up on another tasting panel in the very near future. I believe it's next week, correct?
Great. Hope so.
So Stephanie, who is the master of malts for each 5 of the House of Dewar's single malt distilleries. So we're going to be talking Aberfeldy today, but within the House of Dewar's, we also have Altmore, Gaelic, the Devron, and Royal Brackla. And they all sit nicely within that Bacardi house, or that House of Dewar's, so to speak. She's also the master blender for Dewar's. So her job effectively is to be responsible for not only the production, but the blending of all whiskies that happen. In 2018, Icons of Whiskey awarded her the Master Blender of the Year award. 2019, IWC, which is International Whiskey Competition, made her the first female ever to be awarded Master Blender of the Year. She then backed that up in 2020, and then she backed that up again in 2021, making her the first master blender to ever be awarded that particular award 3 consecutive years in a row. And also, again, the first female who had ever been awarded the IWC Master Blender of the Year award as well. But look, I understand that I'm rambling a little bit, and I do digress.
And you're almost out of time.
Almost out of time. So, blended whiskey, combination of grain and malt. Malt whiskey in Scotland made from 3 things: malted barley, water, and yeast. And that's where we come to Aberfeldy. Now, a lot of people may get confused when you talk about single malts. They think about the fact it comes from a single grain. It refers to the fact that it is whiskey distilled from a single, as in singular, distillery. So Aberfeldy, 1898, this is the first and only distillery the Dewar's family ever owned and operated themselves. John Dewar, the founder of Dewar's, he passed away 1880. The company went to 2 of his sons, John Alexander and Tommy Dewar, and they were responsible for the formation or the building of the Aberfeldy distillery, which was actually designed by the foremost Victorian era architect of distilleries that existed at the time, a gentleman called Charles Doig. And he specialized and predominantly built distilleries throughout the Highland and Speyside region of Scotland. So if you were to talk about Aberfeldy, I mean, Aberfeldy is a distillery, but it's also a place. I mean, the Aberfeldy distillery is in the village of Aberfeldy. It sits on the banks of the River Tay, which is the longest river that exists in Scotland. And I heard a buzzer go off.
Yes, you did.
So I'm gonna, because I don't want to take anyone else's time. If anyone has any questions, throw them in the chat, and thank you so much.
Gareth, thank you. Thank you for that double header. A lot of great information there. Awesome. And your Irish storytelling mother be proud of you too.
Thank you very much.
All right. So next up we have Bruce Perry, who is Global Brand Manager for Mossburn Distillers, here to talk to us about Todabeg. And Bruce is also on the blending team there. He spent 22 years with Marussia, the owners of the brand, and he's 30 years in the wine and spirits business. He's worked in St. Lucia and the UK, and for 15 years he's been lecturing on spirits to the WSET Level 3 program. Also a great master in sake. But Bruce, the way it was described to me is your assignment in Scotland was coming home for you. Is that true?
Yeah, repatriation after all these years.
There you go.
Yes. Thank you for the kind introduction. Thank you to you and your associates for the wonderful opportunity this evening. And Gareth, thank you for your nice words there as well. You're moving from somebody with a long history to somebody with hardly any at all. We are only the second distillery on the Isle of Skye and the first new one in 190 years. If you don't mind, I'm going to share my screen with you. I've got some pictures to show you of what we actually bought.
Great.
In 2014, which might surprise some of you. Let's see if that goes there. There it goes. And so Torreveg is a place. It means the hill above the bay, and it is on the Isle of Skye, which is in the northwest of Scotland. In May of 2014, that is what we bought.
That's what we call a fixer-upper.
Sorry, I beg your pardon?
That's what we call a fixer-upper.
That is what I would call a mess. But I have to give it to people with vision, because I think you could stand me here for a very long time, and I don't think it would cross my mind to make a distillery out of it. It really is something else. It was an old cattle steading, and it was a very, very old building. It's 200 years old, roughly speaking, but some of the stonework that built it was taken from the nearby Castle Camas, which was built in the 1400s. This building was falling over. If you put your fist through the walls, you'd go right through them. The stones just fell out. But because it was so old, it was a protected building. It was a listed building. So we couldn't just knock this down. We had to restore it. And so the first thing is we had a stonemason there for 4 years, every single stone repointed and looked after to make the place safe, first of all. But the other thing about it being a protected building is that the rules meant that we couldn't go any higher than the apex of this roof here. The width, the height, the length of the building were established. So whilst we did a lot of work on the design front, we ultimately, the stills had to fit in that building. And so the thing I really love about the fact that this was protected is that this building talks to us today through the whiskey. This building has played its part in the style of the whiskey that we make, because the shape, the height of the neck of the still is extremely important in the style of whiskey that you ultimately make. So this building, with history back to the 1400s, certainly over 200 years old, is very much alive in our whiskey today. And then we got the place open. I've put up a couple of Gaelic signs there for you. Just this part of the world, Gaelic for many people is the first language and English the second. Not everybody, not by any stretch the imagination, but quite a few. And that's what we turned it into. And there's the old castle I was telling you about from the 1400s. So very beautiful. Looking back at mainland Scotland, please do come and visit us if you're ever in Skye. It's a difficult place to get to, but it's worth the effort. But fast forward 3 years, and suddenly we're inside with a brand new distillery. And so during this time, we were deciding what we were going to make. And I mean, apart from whiskey, obviously, but what style? And so we used the Isle of Skye as our muse. The Isle of Skye is very beautiful, but in a very rugged sort of a way. It's not Caribbean beautiful. It's really, really a rough beauty. And so we thought, well, how are we going to get that elegantly rugged, we started calling it, into a bottle? And so the first thing we did was get really, really heavy peat reek into our barley. So our malted barley was coming in at about 75 phenolic parts per million. This is a high level. But then we wanted to tame it. What we didn't want to do was make a really searingly medicinal style of whiskey. There are many people who excel at that already. we wanted to see if we could tame that ruggedness and create some elegance and some finesse. And so one of the things, we ran long fermentations, 100 hours or so, but we also ran very, very slow distillations. You can see the copper still here. Copper is very much our friend as distillers. Sulfur comes into the distillery in the barley. Copper and sulfur are great friends. They react together, and the more you can break down that sulfur, the more chance you have to make an elegant and fine whiskey. Then we do that. We cut very high. We run a 15-minute foreshot, and we cut at 64%. And that is a very, very high point. And that's where our elegance, our finesse, our softness comes. So we have a lot of peat and yet very elegant and fine. We've planned a 10-year journey to our 10-year-old, taking us through varying styles. We'll put some sherry cask into our next one, Croch Pneumonia, that means the Hill of Peat. And we'll put some Madeira cask into the Altbriach. And hopefully by then we'll be at 2028, 2029, and we'll have a 10-year-old. That's what they're going to look like. So please do look out for them. And if you want to know all the stuff I just said encapsulated in a few words, look at the back label. We give you a lot of information back there. That says in Gaelic, tapalev, it means thank you. And I think we might be at 7 minutes.
You're perfectly on time. Thank you very much, Bruce.
You're very
Top of
welcome.
the leg to you too. Appreciate that very much. So next up is Matthew Connor, who is brand ambassador for Teeling. Matthew entered the Boston cocktail scene as a bartender. He's become a restaurant manager, consultant, ambassador, and is also treasurer of the U.S. Bartenders Guild Boston chapter. So welcome, Matthew.
Thank you. Thank you. So I guess we're here to talk about an Irish whiskey after hearing about a bunch of great scotches. So I'll give you a little bit of history of the brands and kind of like what our vision was when we started the company in general. So Teeling was started by two brothers, Jack and Stephen Teeling, back in 2012. They had previously worked in another distillery together, and they decided that they wanted to start their own company. So Teeling Whiskey Company was born. We hired our first employee was our master blender and distiller, Alex Chasko. Alex has a background in craft beer brewing, and he went to school for distillation after that. So he kind of started off with this mentality that innovation is going to be the future of whiskey in general. So essentially, when they started the company, they kind of wanted to make sure that they were keeping to the roots of Irish whiskey and always looking towards the future. So the whole vision of the company in general is our innovation aspect. So our flagship whiskey, which is our small batch, it's a blended Irish whiskey, and it's aged in ex-bourbon barrels, and then it's finished in rum casks. So you get this really nice rum raisin on the nose and all of those wonderful vanilla notes from the ex-bourbon cask. And then while you're sipping it, you get this kind of like sweetness on the finish from that rum cask as well. So that was how we started the company. And now we have 5 different whiskeys available. So we have our single grain, which is aged exclusively in Cabernet Sauvignon barrels. It's got this beautiful red color, very unique. We have our single malt, which is aged in Oloroso sherry casks, finished in Madeira, port, Cabernet Sauvignon, and white Burgundy barrels. So it's a very complex single malt in general. We also have our single pot still, which I'm going to go into the history of single pot still a little bit because it's a classic Irish whiskey style that can only be made in Ireland. So single pot still was basically bred out of the necessity to cut back on paying so much tax to England. So at a certain point, England was taxing everything for Ireland, essentially, including malted barley. So they decided to throw in unmalted barley into their mash bill, and it kind of created this new style of whiskey. So that's where single pot still came from. And we have a single pot still that's 50% malted, 50% unmalted barley, kind of an unusual mash bill for single pot still in general. And it's aged in ex-bourbon, Virgin American oak, and then Oloroso sherry casks. And then our last whiskey that is in our core range is Black Pits, which just released this previous year. And they oh, sorry. And they, it's a peated single malt aged in ex-bourbon and then finished in Sauterne casks. And so when we started the company in 2012, we built our distillery in 2015. And 4 years after we built our distillery, one of our whiskeys from our vintage line won World's Best Whiskey at the World's Whiskey Awards, or World's Best Single Malt at the World Whiskey Awards. And it was the first time ever that an Irish whiskey company had won that award. So it was kind of a big deal. So essentially we took those components and created black pits based on the flavor profile. So that basically goes through our current lineup. If you can see behind me, there's a ton of other innovation that they do. Unfortunately, most of this stuff is only available in Ireland. But keep an eye out, because usually we do release a few every year in the United States. We have 2 new things coming out this year and early next year. And I don't want to spoil the surprise, but it's one of them part of our Wonders of Wood releases. So it's a take on different woods and how it affects the whiskey in general. So that should be a really cool release. So anyways, back to the actual company itself. So we wanted to bring distillation back to Dublin. And so we put our distillery right in Newmarket Square in the heart of the Liberties in Dublin. And Dublin used to be the epicenter for world whiskey in general. So everybody was looking to Dublin whiskey for a very long time as the best whiskey you could get. And then the Irish temperance movement happened and prohibition in the United States happened. So we went from having many, many distilleries on the island to having like 3 basically. And I think only 2 of them were working for that entire time. So those 2 things decimated the entire Irish whiskey industry. Nowadays, we have a lot more distilleries. I believe they're slated to have like 30 open total by 2025. And then I think there's 10 more that are being built right now that are supposed to open just after that. So it's kind of an exciting time for Irish whiskey in general. And since we opened our distillery in Dublin, there's been multiple distilleries opening in Dublin as well. So it's kind of cool. If you go there, you can do like a whole Dublin tour of different distilleries, kind of like the bourbon tour. Is that my timer?
That's your 2-minute warning.
Okay. All right. Perfect. Anyways, the Liberties, the reason that we chose the Liberties was because that's where all of the Irish whiskey would have been made back in the day. It's basically just outside the castle walls. So people were kind of at liberty to do whatever they wanted to there, or as they say. And so this ties back into the Black Pits, where Black Pits was also part of the Liberties. And it's where all of the leather workers and the blacksmiths were. So it had this kind of like smoky feel to it in general. So they wanted to fashion the whiskey around something like that. So you can see like a whole entire company is all about its innovation, bringing distillation back to Dublin, and just creating a phenomenal product for something that didn't exist for a very long time.
Amazing. Very cool. Thank you, Matthew.
Thank you.
Well said. Well done. Sorry about the timer thing, but we got to keep ourselves on schedule.
It's all good.
So,
it just scared me, that's all.
Yeah. Sorry about that. That's our house rules. So next up, we're going to hear again from a gentleman we heard from earlier. And if you haven't figured it out by now from his initial comments, Ari Sussman is a very experienced master distiller. Ironically, started off with 3 years of winemaking in France, of all places. Then he worked with Michigan State's Artisan Distilling Program to train the next generation of distillers. And he consulted on the building of 15 new distilleries across the United States, bringing his expertise to them. And he worked with the founding team to create the very unique blend of 3-chord bourbon in, of all places, Michigan. Now, we're definitely going to a global level with this. Ari, hello again.
Thank you so much for having me. This is an amazing panel. And to come after Teeling, you should know that Alex is a huge inspiration to a lot of American distillers and blenders as well. And back when I was teaching courses at Michigan State University, we would use the bogwood expression as an example of innovation beyond innovation. So very cool. And we would also actually teach papers written by Chris Middleton from Starward as well. So it's an honor to be on here with you as well. I work with a company called 3-Chord Whiskey. 3-Chord, the brand was founded in 2016 by a very creative individual named Neil Giraldo, who in the 70s and 80s was a rock star of all things. He was a Grammy Award winning guitar player. He was actually the first guitar player ever featured on MTV. He is famous for a number. He wrote Jesse's Girl, which was a big #1 song. And he happens to be the husband, lead guitar player, and producer in the Family Band with his wife, Pat Benatar. So Neil has been a gigging musician for the better part of 40 some years. And in addition to being just an excellent music producer and guitar player, songwriter, he's a playwright and a composer and a creative person. When he was growing up in Cleveland, of all places, to really make this global, his grandfather, Nunzio, lived in the house with him and turned the basement into essentially a winery and distillery. So Neil is what we would call in Kentucky a pedigreed, multi-generational manufacturer of alcohol. Neil had an idea to create a spirits company, and he wasn't totally sure what kind of company to create. And so I had a distillery. He came and we spent some time together. And I asked him about his creative process as a music producer. And he said that when he's really feeling good about what he's doing, he's bringing in musicians from different backgrounds, sometimes different genres, different age groups, putting them in a room and trying to create a vision where all of these different parts are working together in harmony. He said for him, as a creative type, that was really when he felt like he was doing his job well, which made me think that, well, the whiskey version of what he's talking about is something that exists extensively in Scotland and Ireland and across the world, but not so much in America. And what he was talking about in terms of music was really kind of a blending house. He's talking about bringing different sorts of musicians together into a room to cut a track. And in whiskey blending, what we try to do, and this was alluded to earlier, is take individual components and put them together so that there's some kind of harmony and that the sum is greater than the parts. And so to that end, he didn't really, at that point, know what I was talking about in 2016, 2017, because there weren't very many blending houses in the United States. So I took him to a bar. It was not open at the time. This was in the morning, and I brought with me the main tool of the blender. In addition to the nose and the palate, a blender oftentimes carries around a graduated cylinder. This particular graduated cylinder is, and I should say, a lot of spirit companies give away like shot glasses and things like that as swag. Here at 3 Chord, we give away graduated cylinders because these can live on your home bar. And what it means is that in addition to being able to try any bottle that's at your home bar, it's an invitation to make your own dram, to be a participant in the process of creation, and to use all of the components just like we use. Well, we've decided that we're going to source really amazing whiskey from across the United States and Canada to make our expressions. But we invite folks as well, and this is a program that I'm going to get into in just a minute, to become a blender and to use our stock of high quality whiskey that we source from top distilleries around the country to make their own spirit. We decided to call the company 3 Chord, which is a musical reference to the blues. The blues, which is American form of music, which went on to change the entire world, became the basis of rock and roll. We wanted a name for our company that was elemental, and there's a great quote. It says, "All you need to write a song are 3 chords and the truth." And so we constantly remind ourselves that all you need to make a good whiskey is good components and in truth, honesty, integrity, and authenticity. So what we do is we honor values like transparency. We tell people where the whiskey we purchase comes from, how old it is. We tell people what blends we're making in what proportions. And Lars, you mentioned that I have a little bit of a background in winemaking. Before I knew I wanted to be a distiller and a whiskey maker, I thought I wanted to be a winemaker. And so I spent quite a bit of time in France doing that. And I also spent 10 years managing cocktail bars, which is where I learned a little bit. Actually, I learned more about blending, working in cocktail bars, than I did hanging out with distillers. I'm gonna go ahead. So we have about 6 different expressions under the 3-chord label. Our logo is a guitar pick with sun rays coming out of it. And what we've been focusing on doing is purchasing whiskey of different ages and blending them to create new expressions. Everything from our introductory expression, which is a blended bourbon at 81%, which has components coming from 3 different states, Tennessee, Indiana, and Kentucky. And it's smooth and approachable, and that's on one end. On another end, we do have a 15-year-old straight Kentucky. This is an accessible everyday drinker. This is something that you're going to probably want to keep for special occasions. And then we also have, just to highlight a third product of ours, this one's called Strange Collaboration, which is a blend of 2-year-old Kentucky straight bourbon, 5-year-old Kentucky straight bourbon, which we blend and then we finish in Pinot Noir casks for about 3 to 6 months. And the blending of, I understand that there's some students who are studying winemaking and distilling. In the blending of spirits of different ages is honestly a wine technique. It's a technique that we borrowed from winemakers who understand that wine at different stages in its maturity has different aromatics, mouthfeel, flavors. And so oftentimes winemakers will blend even the same whiskey from different ages in order to create a more holistic and compelling product. That is, here at 3-Chord, we borrow a lot from the principles of winemaking, perfumery. Someone mentioned coffee and tea blending. I think it's really interesting as a distiller and as a blender to learn about these sister industries like perfumery, tea blending, coffee, because I think the future of innovation in whiskey is going to come from these principles that have been long established in other industries that we can go and we can study and we can apply to spirit making.
Perfect timing. Thank you, Ari. Brilliant.
Thank you.
Well done. Great information. So as we continue on this whiskey road, I think we have to give the prize to the furthest traveled, to David Vitale of Starward Whiskey. He grew up in Melbourne, Australia, to an Italian family, very comfortable around the table. And he wanted to create a whiskey that was perfect for those moments at the table. So Davide or David, why don't you tell us a little bit more about that, and welcome. You just got to remember to take yourself off of mute, though.
You'd think after 18 months of doing this, we'd kind of have nailed that, but it's the one thing that, trust me, I think it's great. You know, like today we've spoken about people, places, I guess an animal, lyrebird, I'm just kind of going to throw that in there. Ambition, you know, with the Teeling brothers, and music. I mean, this is awesome. And it sort of talks, I think, for the students, you know, about the diversity of whiskey. And certainly when I started thinking about making whiskey in 2007 in Australia, there was plenty of actually local Australian distilleries that were making amazing products at that point in time. But a world of whiskey that really captivated me. And so, you know, in starting Starward, it really wasn't this idea of, I want to prove to the world that Australia can make great whiskey. It was really about saying, what is it that we can bring from the place that it's made to the world that doesn't already exist? Because I think, you know, the wonderful thing that, you know, we've seen today, and Nathan touched on it before, is that all great whiskey talk to the place they're made. You know, most of them in terms of ingredients, the grain, the water, the type of barrel that we use. You know, in the context of Starward, we've got another kind of secret weapon, our climate. We come from Melbourne, Australia, not Florida. And we're kind of famed for having 4 seasons in a day. It can be quite dramatic, you know, in terms of Fahrenheit. It's not uncommon that we're at 100 degrees, 105 Fahrenheit, and 25 minutes later it's 55. And then in the evening it'll climb back up again. And you know, we're all familiar with the outback in Australia. We've got a huge desert in the center of Australia. But we also have another huge desert to our south called Antarctica. And so if you think about Melbourne's in the southeast corner of Australia. And so if you think if the weather's coming from the northwest and hitting Melbourne, it's hot, dry winds. And if it's coming from the southwest, it's freezing, humid winds. And so humidity and dryness have a huge part in maturation and aging. The temperature obviously has a huge part in it. And so, we as a modern distillery are able to kind of capture all those things that are, that make great whiskey, and talk to the place they're made in terms of obviously the grain. All of our malted barley and wheat that we have in our two products come from within a day's drive of the distillery. Water, well, it comes from a tap. I think, back in the day, a lot was made of the source of water. But, if we're talking about Scotland, it was either a boggy marsh that could perhaps kill you or something that was clean, right? Today, it's all a relative thing that, we've got great drinking water in Melbourne. In fact, it's so soft, we have to harden it up. We add calcium to our water for fermentation because it's too soft. Well, it's not too soft, but it's very soft from a fermentation perspective. And barrels. So I'm going to be a little controversial here, but the Teeling Distillery talked about whiskey aged in amazing wine barrels from Bordeaux and Southern California. And we had a conversation about some amazing fortified wine barrels from Portugal and Spain, some bourbon barrels as well. Like, this is the trading stock of Scotch whiskey and Irish whiskey, is to source their barrels from other places. So Starward is actually more Australian than Scotch is Scottish. Never say that in a Glasgow pub. Ask me how I know, but we source our barrels from a day's drive of the distillery from amazing Australian wineries. Wine goes out and whiskey goes in for that full aging period, not a finish, but a start. And so that's a really exciting thing for a couple of reasons. It's bloody delicious, but more than that, it really does land the point that we've kind of seen from everybody today, that a whiskey talks to the place it's made, and the climate that we age our whiskey in means that within 3 Melbourne years, we can have a product that, is award-winning, San Francisco double gold, best in class, all of the things, right? But more importantly, a really accessible whiskey that we can have in the sharing cabinet at home, or an amazing back bars that kind of, look for great whiskeys from around the world. Last, you touched on before that, we have, food. I'm Italian, first generation Australian, but born to Italian parents. Food is at the center of our family life. And I have to say, when I started to think about setting up a distillery, I had this complexity of like, well, what am I going to bring to Christmas with 34 cousins and, all of these aunts and uncles? And so whiskey's very foreign. It was foreign for me. I mean, I think growing up, Johnny Walker was what my Greek friends' dads used to play cards with, and Chivas Regal was what, we gave our accountants for Christmas. So, it was very foreign. Whiskey was very foreign. So sort of thinking about it, I kind of thought, well, I need to craft a whiskey that's, going to work with food. That was kind of my mindset. And we know that wine is the most food friendly of drinks in the world. So I'd argue, and I guess as founder I can say it, that Starward being fully aged in wine barrels is the most food friendly whiskey of all. And for us, it's as much a drink in and of itself, neat with water. But for me, it makes an amazing ingredient to make great cocktails from around the world. Classic cocktails that we see around the world. So that's the Starward story. I know we're kind of pushed up for time. I can talk under concrete, but I think we'll leave it there. And thanks so much for the opportunity to have a chat today.
Dave, thank you very much. Appreciate that. Well done. And I have a real fast question. You were talking about using Australian wine barrels. Matthew, you mentioned that at Teeling they're using Pinot Noir barrels as part of the, did I remember that correctly?
Cabernet Sauvignon. They're from
So it's
California.
obviously not from Irish wine.
No. Yeah, it's from ours are sourced from California.
Okay. All right. Interesting choice. You would think France was a little closer, but okay. So on that note, we're gonna back clean up and go back to Robert Albright with Liars to close it off with a nice cocktail. Robert, please.
All right. So our next cocktail we're going to do to bring it back to the non-alc is we're going to do a non-alc Boulevardier.
Wow.
So, you know, play with the classics is what I like to do. And so we're going to take our American malt, 2 ounces, our San Francisco Spirits award-winning gold aperitif rosso, which is one in the vermouth category. There is no non-alc category. It is a spirit, so that's pretty unique that Liars is able to do that. And our Campari mimic as well. The fun part, the lyrebird comes from the world's greatest mimic, which is the Australian lyrebird. So,
yeah. As Dave mentioned, yeah.
You get to have a lot of fun mimicking these flavors and showing people that they can have a sophisticated cocktail, but in a non-alc format. Now, I like to play with some of the dehydrated fruits and elevate it a little bit. So I'm going to use dehydrated blood orange as my garnish there. And there you have it. A non-alc Boulevardier.
Looks beautiful.
Hey,
Who would have
Robert,
thought we would have been saying that? Yes, sir.
I've got a quick question, which I think
Yes,
might be interesting to the students as well. Like, you know, dilution is such a big part of
Yes.
classic cocktails with booze. How does it play in the non-alc space, and how do you kind of, what's the balance there?
So what we found with the balance, most of us that work with Liars, especially on the sales side, are ex-bartenders from behind the stick. And what we've done is we reduce our ice content. So if we're going to be doing a shaken cocktail, we'll use a third, if not half the amount of ice. If we're going to do a stirred cocktail, sometimes we just use one big cube, or we stir dry and then pour over a cube. That way you're going to get all those flavors, where you're going to get all those aromatics as well that they put into that spirit. So when they created Liars, the way the distillation process is a lot different. We're using essences, extracts, and distillates, and we're playing with the world of gastronomy. We want to really savor and save those flavors so you can still get those in that same mouthfeel instead of diluting it and watering it down.
Excellent. Thank you, Robert. Dave, that was a great question. I have a question that's a little bit of a hand grenade. Bruce might be able to answer this, but Gareth is the one that put it out there. He's the one that said that in Scotland, they call Scotch, they just call it whiskey. What in Scotland do you call whiskey that comes from somewhere else? Keep it clean.
Yeah, we don't use the word Scotch so often. I heard the word grenade and then my name and thought that doesn't sound like a great cocktail. But no, Gareth's absolutely right. We don't really use the word Scotch as much. I hear it far more stateside than I do here. Right. I guess we sort of use a bit of a catch-all phrase, bourbon, by which most people would include a Tennessee whiskey, rather famous one in that, without really realizing that it wasn't. Yeah, other whiskeys.
Other whiskeys, all right.
Bruce, I appreciate you picking that one up, man. Thank you. I do, Lars, I do actually have a quick question for Bruce. It was something that he mentioned that I'm really intrigued by. Your fermentation time, Bruce, you said it was 100 hours. So at Aberfeldy, we have a fermentation time that's a minimum of 72. And if you were to look at the wider landscape within Scotch, the average is probably around about 55, 60 hours as a kind of like general sweep all outside of specific distilleries. What was the thought process for you guys to have that extended fermentation time? Because it's pretty significant. I'm really intrigued.
It is significant. Having said that, I was being slightly economic with the truth in my 7-minute slot. So it's 60 to 130 hours is the real answer. But I just picked a number in the middle there. No, I think you're right. 60 is a long fermentation, and that was realistically what we were going for when we very first started. And a lot of it is to do with just logistics, to be honest with you. But we are seeing some well, we think we're seeing some minor benefits from going on a little bit longer as well. But really, it's just to allow esters to develop and so on and so forth. But you're quite right, you get that after 60 hours. But the extra time seems to be beneficial as well. But given that we've not tweaked that too much, I can't tell you what difference it's making because we haven't done it any other way.
100%. Bruce, I really appreciate the answer. Thank you so much.
No problem.
And I just love Bruce's reference to a Scotsman being economical. Wow. There you have it. So thank you all very much on behalf of FIU's Bacardi Center of Excellence, Lyre's Non-Alcoholic Spirits, and of course the Tasting Panel magazine. As I mentioned earlier, there will be a printed recap in the January-February issue of the Tasting Panel. This recording will shortly be available on tastingpanel.com, as well as our Facebook platform. This was the last of this year's Back to School Spirit. Stay tuned. You can tell I've been sipping on my whiskey. Stay tuned for some new renditions and additions. Professor Connors, you want to add anything in closing?
No, great job, panel guys. Thank you so much. I really appreciate everyone's time and your knowledge. And this is going to, again, live out there for a long period of time. And last but not least, Vice President Dick Cheney, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
There he is. All right. Hey, I'm going to, Bruce Perry, since you come from arguably the motherland of whiskey, can I ask you to leave us with a good toast?
Well, a good toast. I heard a good toast, funnily enough, in New York City last night, not last night, last week. And that was, let us all hope and pray that there isn't a hell, but if there is one, I'll see you at the bar.
Touche.
Cheers. 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 Thanks, everybody.
Cheers all. Thank you.
Thank you all.
Good night.